Hello, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here recording your English 11A. This is the live lesson recording for today. We're covering the 19th century American poetry revolution, and this is we're in the last unit for this class. There's only two more lessons after this one, so we are very close to the end. Um, and this one's actually a fairly quick lesson in comparison to the two last ones. But the subject is poetry, which I know a lot of students kind of struggle with. So you're definitely going to want to take notes on this one. There's a lot of vocabulary in here. So we're going to go ahead and jump into it. I'm going to share my screen and we are going to start with slide number 5 of this lesson, titled Poetic Rhyme. Now, before we get started, I just want to note, I know that a lot of students usually look forward to the poetry lessons because the reading excerpts are not as long as a full story, but keep in mind that poetry is actually just a little more difficult to grasp in terms of the rhythm of the words and things like that. So please don't be under the impression that there's less to worry about. The art of poetry is literally packing a lot of information and imagery and comparisons into a short amount of words. So there's almost twice as many things to keep up with as you would in a normal like prose style story with like the 5 sections of the plot. So if you're having issues with understanding any of the concepts within this lesson, try to go back to previous lessons in this course about poetry. You may want to book a tutoring session to have someone explain the basics of poetry to you. But don't feel bad if you're having a difficult time with working through this. Some stuff is a little easier to recognize, but the structure of poetry makes it a little hard to sort of get in on your first try. Okay, so starting on slide 5 here, we have poetic rhyme, and they talk about different styles of rhyme. So these are all things that you should be familiar with in some way. So we have end rhyme, assonance, and alliteration. And down here at the bottom, they do give you the definition of assonance and consonants, so you can click on those to open them up. But I do want to give you the definitions that they provide in this paragraph at least. The other types, you can and should definitely look them up. So we have slant rhyme. Slant rhyme occurs when two words seem as though they should rhyme and they mean by spelling, but they actually do not. So they give you examples of things that have exact rhyme. So things that do rhyme, they give you the opposite definition first. So enough and tough are spelled alike and they sound alike, right? But the words enough and though, even though they're spelled alike, they both have the O-U-G-H. They have slant rhyme because enough looks like it will rhyme with though at first glance. But obviously saying them out loud, you can tell that they have different O sounds. So that's what slant rhyme is. There's 100% chance that you're going to get a question on the mastery test about slant rhyme. There is, in fact, a specific question that asks you to put like basically to match the different types of rhyme with different examples. So you're going to need to put this in your notes. So they technically gave you two definitions here, and it's important to note that they told you the difference between exact rhyme here and slant rhyme. So don't just write down the example for slant rhyme. You also want to know what exact rhyme is. It's when two words seem like they rhyme and are spelled similarly, and they do. Slant rhyme is when they seem like they would rhyme based on the spelling, but they do not. Assonance here, if we open up this window, They give you the definition right here. Let me move myself up here. So it says here, a literary device that uses repetition of the same vowel sound within several closely grouped words, right? Example, the fish will not quit flapping its skinny fins. So there is a I sound repeated here. We have the I in fish. We have the I and technically will is also a part of this. We have quit, we have its, we have skinny. So the first part, ski, is the same I sound. And then we have fins. All of these are similar vowel sounds. As a refresher, vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y, depending on how it's used in a word. Consonants is the inverse of that. Not the opposite, but the inverse. So it's when you have consonant sounds that are repeated. So consonants are anything that's not A, E, I, O, and U. So the example they give you here is Matt was not about to write a note to Dot. So we've got a lot of T words here. Matt, not, about, write, note, and Dot. So keep in mind that consonants doesn't have to be at the beginning of a word. I feel like most of you are gonna think of alliteration, which is when consonants repeat at the beginning of a word. Consonants is when a consonant sound is repeated in a sentence. It doesn't matter where the word is though, or where the sound is. It says here, especially ending sounds, but as long as they're not at the beginning, which is alliteration, it could be counted as consonants. So if you're writing down this definition, you're going to want to put this section here in a box or underline it or highlight it or something like that, especially ending sounds. And if you need to add a note to say like on the side, this is different from alliteration, which is consonant sounds repeating at the beginning and then underline that of a word, it might help you to do that so that you don't confuse the two. Because there is a possibility that they might give you like a trick question that has alliteration listed as one of the choices. Alrighty, we're moving on to slide 6. Slide 6 actually has the poem that you'll be looking at in the actual the slide, so you don't have to click an extra link or anything. So basically, they use Emily Dickinson here as an example because she uses a lot of different rhyme techniques in her work. And they give you an example of slant rhyme. And they do this in her poem. Emily Dickinson's poems are very short usually. But the poem they feature here is Hope is the Thing with Feathers. So I'm going to go ahead and read it out just because it's so short. So it says, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So in this excerpt, soul and all are not a strict rhyme. They do have consonants, so they both end with that L sound. But looking at those words, there are certain words that have that OU, and you would expect that OU to make a ah sound. But here, soul, they make a O sound. So looking at a glance, someone might think that they rhyme. Not all words that rhyme, for example, sound alike. So try to keep that in mind when you're looking at these. I know most students would say, they would look at this and say, oh, well, soul isn't spelled the same as all, so obviously it doesn't rhyme. But there are words that are spelled differently that do rhyme. So for example, if anyone knows a person's with the last name Reid, R-E-I-D, that I-E can still make that E sound, right? And that's very different from the word read that we use every day, like reading a book, that's R-E-A-D. But the two of those, even though they're spelled similarly, even though they're spelled differently, they sound similar. They have the same sound, even though the consonant, the ending vowel is different. So just, try to remember this one in particular, soul and all. This is slant rhyme. They look like They might rhyme, but they do not. Okay, we are going to go to slide 9 here, which is internal rhyme. So we're learning a little more about internal rhyme. This is a different type of rhyme than slant or exact rhyme. So internal rhyme, they gave the definition here. It's less common in poetry than end rhyme. So internal rhyme is when, here's the definition. Internal rhyme occurs within the same line of a poem. So the rhyme usually lies in the accented vowel in the following consonant. And they give you an example. So this is a line from T.S. Eliot's poem, Gerontion. And it says, "Here I am, an old man in a dry month." So it's the words I and dry that rhyme. So this is what they're giving you the example of to show you it's in the same line. This is one single line of the poem, and there are words that rhyme with each other. Yes, within this same single line. An and man also rhyme. So the line contains internal rhyme. Internal rhyme happens in a lot of places that we don't notice, and it does help the smoothness of reading. When we have a lot of sounds in a sentence that sounds similar, it means we don't have to shape our mouths or move our tongues in a drastic way to say the next words or the words that follow. So lines that have internal rhyme usually go much more smoothly. Some people will notice that, like in lyrics to music, they do a lot of internal rhyme because it helps with the rhythm of the song, and it helps to establish kind of like a melody to the words when you have a lot of them that sound similar in the same line. So it says here, internal rhyme changes the pace of a poem by either speeding up or slowing down the reader's eye. So poetry is not just an art of writing something. It's also the art of constructing a message that looks a certain way. So it's not just shape. It's not just the shape of the poem. It's not just the text of the poem. It's both at the same time. So how it looks and how it reads are both equally important. And that's why things like, for example, slant rhyme exists, where you're looking at words that look like they will rhyme, but they don't, because you're scanning ahead when you read, right? You are taking a look at what is happening ahead of what you read, and that affects how you read things. So poetry is supposed to entice or engage the part of your brain that is planning ahead for the next words that you're about to say, and also imparting meaning at the same time. Okay, here we're getting into the reading selections. So we're starting with Sarah Morgan Bryan Piat, and she wrote a poem called "In a Queen's Domain." And so we're just going to go through this paragraph a little bit about her before we look at the poem. So she was born in Lexington, Kentucky in 1836. She attended Henry College, and it was an all-girls school. And she studied a lot of romantic poets. So her basically she was influenced a lot by Emily Dickinson, whose poem we just read, Robert Browning, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, at least her early poetry. And then it says that Piet's poetry contained more irony and political themes, which were reflective of realism. So realism is the movement that was a response to romanticism. And I believe we've covered that in previous lessons, but just as a refresher, realism was the response to romantics. Basically, romantic poetry and writing focused a lot on having nature as a inspiration, and the point of romanticism was to provide work for people to read in terms of stories. that allowed them to sort of get away from the complexity of life at the time, which was during the Industrial Revolution. So this was a time where the emphasis of writing was on connecting people to things that they couldn't interact with in real life. And realism was a response to that, saying like, no, these people are having a difficult time, they're suffering, they need to be able to experience work that shows you how real people are, not just the idea of people sitting on a lake and reflecting on their life, or writing about going on a walk in the woods. Sometimes it's important for people to actually see realistic portrayals of what's happening in life around them, because if you give people too much fantasy, they'll start to think that that's really what life is like instead of just taking it for entertainment purposes. So it pretty much tells you here in the information about her that she had more irony and political themes. So that tells you that she was trying to give people a little more real information about the situation around them and what was going on in Britain at the time. Okay, so I'm going to give you a moment to go over In a Queen's Domain, which is in 1876. I usually don't go over, as a reminder, I usually don't go over reading selections. If you're really struggling with any of your reading selections, you should definitely contact your advocate or your mentor about getting scheduled for tutoring. But take a couple moments to look at In a Queen's Domain. Go ahead and click that link right here. And then you can meet me in a couple minutes on slide 14. There is a question that you have to answer in between there, I think. But yeah, take a moment, read that, and we'll be right back. Okay, so on slide 14 is the review for some of the aspects that are in A Queen's Domain. So this tells you about some of the things in the poem, but it's not the same as reading the poem. It doesn't go over every single line. So make sure that you actually take a moment to read the poem itself before looking at this, because sometimes they will ask you questions about how a poem progresses on the mastery test. And these just point out very specific things, and they don't give you the full overview of the poem. So just going over this slide 14, it tells you that this poem starts off with a traditional romantic format. So it starts with a strict meter. Meter is like the rhythm of the words, how many syllables are in it, and the kind of sounds that they have. And then it has soft, pretty images. So basically, she starts this off like a romantic poem. There's the image of flowers, roses, and they give you the excerpts here. My subject, the rose, I know will give me her breath and her blush. And it says here that the rhyme scheme is uncomplicated, and the sentimental view of nature is obvious. So if they're talking about a rose and talking about how it's going to give her a blush, then they're clearly talking about and appreciating nature, which is very typical for a romantic era poem. It says here that the rhyme scheme is uncomplicated, so there's nothing hard to memorize going on here or hard to point out. So you should be able to look at the lines and figure out what the rhyme pattern is without too much difficulty. It goes on to say that Piat goes on to talk about her view of nature and her love of animals. But then halfway through this poem, she changes her tone, right? And she starts talking about different types of animals and plants that are not pleasant to look at. She starts talking about tigers, snakes, thorns for flowers. So by changing the tone, she's basically giving you an idea of the difference between how someone will discuss nature and romanticism versus how it actually is when you're out there. Yes, things looking like they look nice in nature, It's nice being outside to meditate or whatever. But usually, when you're outside for a prolonged period of time, there's a lot of danger that you have to deal with. Um, she talks about bees stinging and thorns that tear at your clothes if you're stumbling through the brush. So, what she's trying to communicate here is that things in nature often bring pain, and uh, even in the queen's ideal sense of nature, there's still actually things to be worried about. And she's basically trying to tell people who are reading the poem that it's the same in real life. Yes, it's nice to read about things that help take you away from the pressures of daily life, but you actually have to keep in mind um, how things actually work in nature and how dangerous it is. Anyone can take a stroll outside, but if you're stuck outside for weeks on end, it'll be difficult for you to provide for yourself, and you might get injured or sick or die. And she's just sort of bringing it to everyone's attention that, like, it's important to discuss nature in a realistic way and not just in a way that makes people feel like it's easy to interact with it when it actually isn't. Alrighty. Oh, alrighty. So slide 16 here. It says here in her poem, In a Queen's Domain, Piat refers to each aspect of nature as the queen's subject, which is a play on words that begins with the poem's title. So everything's characterized as belonging to the queen. So she sees the creatures as her subjects, like she's over them, she has power over them. But at the same time, they are the subjects or topic of Piat's poem, and that's the things that she writes about. So there's a parallel running there. They are the queen's subjects in that she has power over them, and in a similar way, Piat has power over what she's writing about. And then it says here, since much romantic writing is about the natural world, Piat's two-pronged use of the word subject may indicate her belief that romantic writers try to rule or control nature through writing about it. And that goes into her message about being realistic about portraying nature. You have to give people very real portrayals of what it is they're going to see when they're out there, not just to make things look pretty. It's fine to be inspired by nature, but you also have to give people an idea of what it is like. The entire point of writing is to give people a window to things that they normally wouldn't be able to see or deal with. And she's basically saying that there's a responsibility to writers to do that in both ways, both to give them an escape sometimes, but also to give them real information about what it's like to do or be certain things. Alrighty, moving on here to our second excerpt. We have Emily Dickinson, and we read one of her poems a little earlier in the lesson, but this is another poem called Dying. So we're going to get a little bit of information about Emily Dickinson and then move on to the poem. I believe there is one or two poems left after this one. Yeah, I think that there's one more after this one. Alrighty. So the important things to sort of put in your notes from this slide is that Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 into a strict household in Amherst, Massachusetts. But her family encouraged education and learning. So she definitely went to school for reading and writing. Her father kind of limited what she was able to read in her home, but she enjoyed the poems of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And those are a lot of the people who influenced her. So she wrote over 1,000 poems, almost 2,000 in the span of her life, but most of them were published after her death. So that's posthumously. And it says her most productive year coincided with the onset of the US Civil War in 1861. And that was an event that greatly affected Dickinson. And you can tell that in her works. there was a very high death toll for the Civil War, and a lot of her family members also died in the years that followed from like lingering injuries and grief and lots of other things. So that heightened Dickinson's interest in death as a topic, and it became common in her poetry. I think most people who have read any poems from Emily Dickinson are used to the topic of death. And she pretty much stayed secluded in her family home until she died herself. So this poem is literally called Dying, so that, fits within the theme. And they have a couple questions here that they want you to consider while reading. It says here, what characteristics of realism does Dickinson use in this poem? And what characteristics of romanticism does she use in the poem? So that tells you right there that there's the possibility that she uses a little bit of both. Now I want to pause here since we're a little like close to halfway through the rest of the lesson, and just talk about why it's important to know information about the authors. I've talked about this in a few other live lessons before, but I just want to make sure that anyone who hasn't watched these in a while, or who hasn't looked at any of the other ones, has an idea of why. I'm sure that while you're getting all this information about the authors, you're kind of like, what is this for? It's important to keep in mind that people are influenced by their lives and the things that happen to them. If you were to write a story about anything, it would be influenced by what you know and what has happened to you in your life. Because obviously, if you don't know something, and also you don't know that there's something you don't know, you can't write about it. So this information that we get on all of the authors that they give you is actually important, because giving you a summary of how a person grew up, where they went to school, what type of events happened in the world while they were growing up and while they were writing. All of these things can help with understanding what might be influencing their writing within the poem. The study or the poem or story. The study of history is very close to the study of culture, and English literature is a part of the culture of people who speak English. So all of the things that people value at the time that they were born and grew up is going to make its way into their writing. And that's why it's very important to take a look at the history behind things. Knowing what was going on at the time gives you insight into what they're writing and why, and how they might have been affected by what was going on. So that's why you kind of always get a little background information on the author. And for some lessons, you also get history lessons about just what was happening in the country or place that the author was in at the time that they were writing, sometimes a little before. You guys are in 11th grade English now, but in the 12th grade classes, there's very much history. So you're definitely going to be prepared, or want to be prepared for that. There's a lot of background information that explains why certain things were written. As we go on in history, a lot of people write works in response to things that happen. So for example, Emily Dickinson was affected by the Civil War in 1861, right? If you don't know what that is, or you don't know why it would have affected her writing, you'd probably be asking, what made her write this? What made her focus on death? But they give you a little bit of that information here in the summary. It's the death toll of the Civil War and having some of her relatives die in the war. When you have things that affect you personally, it affects how you see the world, and that affects how you choose to write things, or what your attitude is towards the things that you write. And it's important to keep that in mind. But okay, mini lecture over. Go ahead and take a moment to read the poem Dying. It's not very long, especially because it's an Emily Dickinson poem. And you can meet me over at slide 19. Okay, hopefully you took a moment to pause and read Dying by Emily Dickinson if you're here. So we're here on slide 19. And we're just going to go over some of the points about the poem. and the devices, the literary devices that she used. So here, they pretty much tell you that some scholars view Emily Dickinson as a bridge between the Romantic and Realist movements. So the questions kind of gave you a hint from the previous slide 17, that she uses elements of both in her poems. And they pretty much tell you her poem Dying contains elements from each era. So it realistically portrays an event, which is the speaker's death. But it says here the speaker creates a will beforehand and while dying observes a fly buzzing through the room. There's no sentimentality or idealism present, despite the emotional subject of death. The poem simply describes the death of the speaker in a realistic, detached way. And then they give you the romantic side of things. So while the lack of sentimentality and idealism are characteristics of realism, Dickinson also uses certain romantic or not realistic elements in a few lines. And they give you the excerpt of that. So the lines between the heaves of storm and the eyes around had wrung them dry are portrayed more melodramatically than realistically. So between the heaves of storm, you're comparing the breaths to a storm, and the eyes around had wrung them dry. You can't actually wring your eyes dry. So she's definitely being melodramatic here by using hyperbole. So she, in that way, is using a little bit of unrealistic writing kind of imagery to paint a picture of how dramatic her real reaction actually feels. The poem also focuses on the speaker's thoughts and actions, which is a characteristic of the Romantic era. Usually, if you're focusing on just one person and their inner thoughts about something, that's a very romantic way to write a poem. And then it says here, the speaker describes the events of the room by stressing the imaginary details more than the realistic ones. For example, she theatrically portrays the motion of the fly as blue, certain stumbling buzz. Okay. So now we're moving on to the last excerpt here. Looking at Walt Whitman. So we get some background information on him, of course. So Walt Whitman was born in West Hills, New York in 1819. So this is an American author. He worked as a teacher, government employee, and a journalist. And he also participated in the US Civil War by volunteering as a nurse. So what this tells you is that he and Emily Dickinson have a lot alike. They're both American. They were both affected by the US Civil War, especially in Walt Whitman's case through participating in it. So he's one of the most renowned, that means well-known American poets of the 19th century. Like if you did a Google search on Walt Whitman, you would find a lot of information. And a lot of people consider him to be a poem that represents American individualism and democracy, because he was a very strong proponent or supporter of people coming together to form the values of America. It says here that the legacy of that is secured in his life's work. Absolutely. It's almost impossible to read anything of his without getting that kind of vibe. And it was first published in 1855 in his novel-length poetry collection. And that book is called Leaves of Grass. And it says he rewrote, edited, and republished the work multiple times before his death in 1892. So that also tells you that he was very strongly in charge of his writing, whereas Emily Dickinson had to have family members publish her work after she passed away. Walt Whitman definitely published his work. He was very popular and he could afford to go back and go through and republish it several times after making changes. So it says here, Whitman often incorporated realist views in his poem. Songs of Myself, for example, emphasizes the individual experiences of humans and the common humanity that all people share. And this is a theme that's in a lot of his poems. It says his poems reflect an open and honest perspective of the world on reality. And much like the poems of Sarah Morgan Bryant Piatt and Emily Dickinson's, something that they all share in common. All right. So before you get to reading Song of Myself, they give you a little bit of a pointer on how to take notes on those sort of things. So a dialectical journal is pretty much a way for you to take notes on your thoughts for lines of poetry. So it's basically stopping while you're reading a poem to take notes on what the line makes you think of. So you're actually paying attention to the words that are used, you're paying attention to how they are used. And when you're done reading a line, you stop and check to ask yourself, do I have any thoughts about this? Does this make me feel anything? Is there some pattern about the words? Or is there some way that I could connect to this? Do I know what this feeling is? And then they give you a little background on just how and why it's named the way it is. Dialectic comes from the Latin word dialectus, which means discussion. So it's basically you having a discussion for yourself with the text. So you're actually responding to the text as if someone wrote it for you, and that can actually help you think of different ways that you are processing what you're reading. Because a lot of people just go through and they just drag their eyes over the words, but it actually helps if you take a moment to take notes on your thoughts on every line of a poem and actually try to figure it out while you're reading. It's another way for focus. Okay, so after you take notes on this slide, I would write down the definition of a dialectical journal. And I would also write down, just the background on the word dialectic, since it's in the first sentence. And if you want an example about what types of notes that you should take to keep for other classes, excuse me, I would definitely write down this example right here, just the table that's here in general. But anyway, after you're done with that, take a moment to click on the link there at the bottom for Song of Myself and read it. And then meet me over at slide 25, and then we'll talk about a little bit of it. Okay, so if you're here, you've paused to read Song of Myself, and we're going to go over some of what makes this poem iconic and some of the ways that he uses certain literary devices in it. Now, they start off by telling you that Walt Whitman is considered to be the first poet to use free verse, and in a way, he's the father of American modernist poetry. So modern poetry is basically poetry that was written leading into the modern era. So we're talking the 1900s, basically. His poem, Song of Myself, which is part of the Leaves of Grass book that we talked about earlier, it's written entirely in free verse, and then they give you the definition of that. So there are free verses when there's no instances of adherence to strict meter, so there's no rhythm patterns to the words that are chosen or the length of the lines, rhyme or definite form. So you don't have to worry about rhyme or anything like that in these in the lines of this poem. But it does say that he employs parallelism and other structural elements. So we're going to get into that down here. So he permeates, that means like he distributes throughout, so in different places throughout this poem. The entirety of the poem with parallelism. So parallelism is pretty much when you write different lines with the ideas or structure that repeats in different places throughout the poem. So it says his use of parallelism connects the American individual with the idea of citizenry. So just to go over the connection here for parallelism. So in these lines we have, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. So we have in each section of these sentences, there's repetition. So we've got something about him, and then something about he's talking about the person who is reading. We've got myself, then we have assume and assume if you break these sentences in half. And then we have belonging to me, and then belongs to you. So these sentences can be, or lines can be broken into parts where the structure is repeating. And that's what parallelism is. When you write different lines or sentences with the same or very similar structure to the point where there's a pattern for how you are writing the sentences. So it says here, the parallelism brings the individual, myself, and citizenry, you, together in recognizing their common American identity. So he starts off talking with how he celebrates himself. And then he starts talking about how you and him have things in common. So he's using that repetition to help you understand and bridge the idea that what he's saying applies to himself is something that also applies to you. Like the mimicking or repeating of those patterns within those lines makes it a little easier for you to understand that he's saying these things that I'm saying about myself, I'm also giving them to you in this poem. These things also apply to you. Okay, on slide 26, we go over another example of parallelism here. So we have vivas to those who have failed, and to those whose war vessels sank in the sea, and to those themselves who sank in the sea, and to all generals that lost engagements, and all overcome heroes, and the numbers of unknown heroes equal to the greatest heroes known. So first of all, we have repetition of a lot of the word and. So we have and repeating in these 4 lines here. But then we also have these 2 lines repeating sank in the sea and sank in the sea. And by repeating those ideas, he's emphasizing the fact that similar things can happen to you as the people who are, like running and affected by events like war vessels sinking into the sea in terms of war. And he offers vivas, which is like cheering or kudos, accolades, not just to the greatest heroes known here at the end, but also to those who have failed. So he's saying like every single person's input and effort into the war to help others and to push for what he feels is the right thing makes you a hero. It's not just people who do the impossible. It's people who do anything, who tries to do anything. And this repetition, again, just sort of brings together people who are trying to do noble things and people who are just trying to survive in everyday life. People whose war vessels sank and people who just sank themselves. So not even doing anything having to do with war. He's basically saying that everyone deserves to be acknowledged no matter if they are a big hero or not. And the reason why he's emphasizing this is that he's saying that regular citizenry and Americans should be recognized and heralded as putting effort forth just by being here and furthering the idea of democracy as anyone who is doing things during wartime. And then he also talks about numberless unknown heroes equal to the greatest heroes known, right? So he's saying that just because we don't know what you did doesn't mean that you didn't do anything. He's stressing really hard through this repetition of ideas using the same words and phrases over and over. Sank in the sea, overcome heroes, heroes who are unknown, heroes who are greatest. the idea is to spread that the accolades, the cheering is for every single person. And by doing that, he's trying to communicate that in a way, as being citizens of America, we're furthering the idea of freedom and equality. So everyone deserves to be equally acknowledged, even if we don't for certain know about what they did. Alrighty. On slide 27, we go into another example of the theme of equality because it happens a lot in this poem. So he emphasizes gender equality, which is not something that many people supported during that time, but Walt Whitman was very specific. I am the poet of the woman, the same as the man, and I say it is as great to be a woman as to be a man. So he's basically saying that women are the same as men and they are great. And this was not a view that everybody shared at the time. So he's just being very loud and proud about his thoughts about gender equality. Alrighty. I think that we're towards the end of the lesson now. And there's a focus on language. Okay, so I've emphasized this in quite a few of my lessons, but it's important to note, if there is a focus on language section, there are going to be questions about these vocabulary words. So you don't have to write down this entire table, but what you do need to do is write down these words, the part of speech, that's this word that's, I'm sorry, this letter that's at the bottom. So V is for verb, N is for noun, and occasionally you'll have an adjective. So an adjective describes something, usually a noun. Just as a very quick overview, verbs are action words. When you run, when you jump, when you climb, those are verbs. A noun is a person, place, thing, or idea. So if you were to say, I am going to the store, I is referring to a person, it is a noun. The store is referring to a place, it is a noun. And depreciating here, oh, I'm sorry, deprecating, different word. Deprecating is an adjective, so it describes a noun. Adjectives describe a noun. So for example, if you wanted a quick example of an adjective, tall is an adjective. That person is tall. You're describing the person, which is a noun, and giving us a picture of what they look like, or at least something about what they look like. So tall is an adjective. You're going to want to write down the word and the part of speech so you can remember what it is. And then you're going to write down the definition. That's the bare minimum of what you should write down here. Now they give you the pronunciation of these words so that you can actually know how to say them. So abeyance. And then they have deprecating, sewing, or sowing in this case, I'm sorry, sowing. And bequeath. So these are words that are kind of hard to remember how to pronounce if you don't come across them very often. So if you need to write down pronunciation, you can. You don't have to though. If nothing else, you need this word and part of speech, and you need this definition. The rest, you should only write down if you think you need it. And I think that that is actually it for this slide. Yeah, alrighty, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, yeah, so we've got 2 more lessons after this one. This one wasn't that complicated. It wasn't quite as in-depth as some of the other lessons that we've had on reading, but it was packed with a lot of things. Poetry is sometimes pretty difficult, so make sure that you take your time while you're going through this. If you need to go back over anything, then feel free to do that. If you're having a lot of trouble with understanding anything that I discussed or went over, please book a tutoring session so that we can try to help you as best as possible. Alrighty, I think that that is it. This is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with the rest of your English class because there's only 2 lessons left. Bye now.